Marriage is supposed to be the safest thing two people can build together. The vows are clear: to love, to honor, to stay. The person who shares your bed, your bank account, and your last name is supposed to be the one person in the world who would never hurt you. Your wife is supposed to be the last person you fear. For the men in these cases, the greatest threat in their lives was not a stranger or an enemy. It was the woman who slept beside them, the woman who carried their children, the woman who stood as an altar and promised forever. The men in these stories trusted their wives completely. Every single one of them paid for that trust with his life. Today, the cases of 10 wives who committed cold-blooded murder. What you are about to hear will leave no doubt that sometimes the most dangerous person in a man's life is the one wearing his ring. Case 1. Pamela Smart, the teacher who used a teenage boy. On the evening of May 1st, 1990, Gregory Smart pulled into the driveway of his condominium at 4 Misty Morning Drive in Derry, New Hampshire. He was 24 years old. He had been married for less than a year. He worked as an insurance salesman, and he was tired from a long day at the office. His dog Halen, a Shih Tzu named after the rock band, would have greeted him at the door. The condo was quiet. His wife Pamela was not yet home from her job at the school district office in Hampton. Gregory walked through the front door of his own home for the last time. He set down his things in the foyer. He had no reason to think anything was wrong. The neighbourhood was safe. His marriage was, in his mind, going through some rough patches, but nothing that could not be fixed. He and Pamela had recently celebrated their first wedding anniversary on May 7th of the previous year. They had a dog, they had a condo, they had jobs, they had a future. Within seconds of stepping inside, Gregory Smart was on his knees in his own foyer with a knife pressed against his throat. A 17-year-old boy named Patrick Randall held the blade. A 15-year-old boy named William Flynn stood a few feet away with a .38 caliber pistol. Both teenagers had been hiding in his home, waiting for him. Both had been instructed by Gregory's own wife to make his murder look like a burglary that went wrong. Flynn raised the gun, pressed it close to Gregory's head, and fired a single hollow-point bullet. Gregory died on the floor of the home he and Pamela had picked out together. By the end of the year, the entire country would know the name Pamela Smart. The trial that followed would become the first murder trial in American history, broadcast live on television from start to finish. It would inspire a novel, a Hollywood film, and decades of debate. And it would put a 22-year-old high school media coordinator behind bars for the rest of her natural life, while the boy who pulled the trigger would walk free 25 years later. Pamela Ann Wojcik was born in Coral Gables, Florida, on August 16, 1967. She grew up in Miami before her family moved to Derry, New Hampshire, when she was in 8th grade. At Pinkerton Academy in Derry, she was a cheerleader and an honor student. She was bright, blonde, ambitious, and obsessed with rock music, especially the band Van Halen. She graduated and went on to Florida State University, where she earned a degree in communication. She wanted to be a television news anchor someday. She wanted to be famous. She met Gregory Smart at a party in Florida in February 1986. He was easygoing, athletic, and devoted to her almost from the start. By 1989, they were married. Gregory moved with her back to New Hampshire, and they bought a condo together in Derry. He took a job selling insurance with his father's company. She got a job as the Media Services Director at School Administrative Unit 21 in Hampton, where she ran the school's audio-visual programs and helped with student-run projects. She was 22 years old and supervising teenagers only a few years younger than herself. The marriage started cracking within months. Gregory had cheated on Pamela once during their engagement, something he had confessed to her in the hopes of starting fresh. Pamela had not let it go. She brought it up during fights. She told friends she felt trapped. She complained that Gregory was too focused on his job, that he wanted children too soon, that he did not understand her ambition. Behind the picture of the young married couple in the suburban condo was a wife who was already looking for an exit, and a husband who had no idea his wife was thinking about ways to disappear from his life. The fracture came in the form of a teenager, in late 1989, alongside students. One of the individuals who volunteered for the program was someone named William Flynn, known to his friends as Billy. He had blonde hair and a baby face. He played in a band. He was, by every account, a normal person from a middle-class family. He had a crush on the older woman who ran the media program, the way many people develop crushes on authority figures. The difference is that this was noticed and boundaries were not maintained. In February 1990, Pamela Smart made her move. She invited Billy Flynn to her condo while Gregory was out of town. She put on a video of the film 9.5 Weeks, a movie known for its mature content. By the end of that night, the 22-year-old wife of Gregory Smart had begun an inappropriate relationship with a younger individual. The age of consent in New Hampshire was 16. She was already committing a crime. Within weeks, the relationship became a full obsession on Billy's side. He believed he was in love. He told his friends. He told his classmates. Pamela kept feeding the fire, sending him messages, spending time with him at her home, taking him on overnight trips while Gregory was away. Then, sometime in March 1990, she started talking about more permanent solutions to her marriage. She told Billy that if she divorced Gregory, she would lose everything. She would lose the condo, lose her dog, lose her furniture. She told him she could not start a new life with him unless Gregory was no longer around. According to Billy's later testimony, Pamela threatened to break up with him if he refused to do it. She mentioned a life insurance policy of about $140,000 that would come to her if Gregory died. She suggested they make the killing look like a robbery so the insurance would pay out without any suspicion falling on her. She introduced Billy to her plan, gave him a deadline, and pressured him every time he hesitated. Billy did not act alone. He recruited 2 friends, Patrick Randall and Vance__0_Latime Jr., both 16, to help him. He also told a 16-year-old girl named Cecilia Pierce, an intern at the school where Pamela worked. Cecilia knew about the affair. She would later become the most important witness in the case. In the weeks before the murder, Billy and his friends made 2 failed attempts. The first time, Gregory came home with his parents and the boys called it off. The second time, the timing did not work. Pamela kept pushing. She wanted it done. She wanted her dog Halen's safe, and she gave Billy specific instructions to put the dog in the basement before Gregory arrived, so the dog would not be hurt or get in the way. She also instructed them not to bloody the white leather couch in the living room because she wanted to keep it. The day was set for May 1st, 1990. Pamela left for a school board meeting that evening as her alibi. Billy Flynn, Patrick Randall, and J.R. Latime drove to her condo. Latime stayed in the car as the getaway driver. Flynn and Randall went inside. They put the dog in the basement just as Pamela had told them. They ransacked drawers and pulled jewellery to make the scene look like a burglary. Then they waited. When Gregory walked in the door, Patrick Randall grabbed him from behind and forced him to his knees in the foyer. He held a butcher knife from the Smart family's own kitchen against Gregory's throat. Billy Flynn pointed the gun. According to his later confession, Billy hesitated. He told the court he could not bring himself to do it. Then Randall snapped at him to get on with it. Flynn said a final word to Gregory, told him that God forgives him, and pulled the trigger. Gregory Smart slumped forward, dead in his own foyer. The boys grabbed the jewellery, ran to the car, and drove off. They took the murder weapon and Pamela's instructions with them. They believed they had committed the perfect crime. Pamela came home from her meeting later that night and called the police, sobbing. When officers arrived, she screamed about her dead husband and refused to look at his body. The Derry police initially treated it as exactly what Pamela wanted them to see, a robbery that ended in murder. The drawers were pulled out. Jewellery was missing. The dog had been moved. There was no sign of forced entry, but Pamela mentioned that they sometimes left the door unlocked. The case looked like a tragedy that struck a young couple at random. Within days, that story started falling apart. The teenagers could not keep quiet. Billy Flynn cried at school. Patrick Randall bragged. J.R. Latime told his friends. By June, rumours were spreading through Winnacunnet High School that some of the boys had killed Mrs. Smart's husband. J.R. Latime's grandmother found a handgun missing from the family home. J.R.'s father became suspicious enough to test-fire the gun and turn the bullet over to police, who matched it to the bullet that killed Gregory. Cecilia Pierce, the 16-year-old intern, was already wrestling with what she knew. The police approached her. They convinced her to wear a hidden recording device and have conversations with Pamela about the murder. Over several days in July 1990, Cecilia recorded Pamela talking openly about the killing. Pamela coached Cecilia on what to say to investigators. She told her not to admit to anything. She talked about how the boys had carried out the plan. She used the words, quote, one-in-one conversation, a phrase that would become the most damaging piece of evidence at trial. On August 1, 1990, Detective Daniel Pelletier walked into the parking lot of Pamela's school. She recognized him. She asked him what was going on. He told her he had good news and bad news. The good news was that they had solved her husband's murder. The bad news was that she was under arrest. Pamela Smart was placed in handcuffs and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and witness tampering. Her trial began in March 1991 at the Rockingham County Superior Court. It was a spectacle. Cameras were allowed in the courtroom for the first time in a high-profile American murder case. The trial was broadcast live on court TV every day. The country watched a 23-year-old woman in a smart business suit sit beside her lawyers as her teenage co-conspirators took the stand and described how she had used sex, manipulation, and her position as their school authority figure to convince them to kill her husband. Billy Flynn cried as he testified. Patrick Randall laid out the plan. Cecilia Pierce played the secret tapes. Pamela took the stand in her own defense and insisted she was innocent. She insisted the boys had killed Gregory on their own and were now lying to save themselves. The jury did not believe her. After 14 days of trial, on March 22, 1991, Pamela Smart was found guilty on all counts. She was sentenced that same day to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was 23 years old. The 4 boys received plea deals. Billy Flynn, who pulled the trigger, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 28 years to life. Patrick Randall got the same. J.R. Lattime got 30 years. The 4th teen, Raymond Fowler, who had been at the scene only briefly, got 15 to 30 years. All 4 have since been released. Billy Flynn walked out of prison in June 2015 after serving 25 years. He was 41 years old. Pamela Smart is still in prison. She is now 58. She is held at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in Westchester County, New York, the longest-serving woman at that facility. She has earned a doctorate in ministry and 3 master's degrees while incarcerated. She has tutored other inmates. She has been ordained as a minister. For 34 years she insisted she was innocent, claiming that she had been the victim of a media circus and that the teenagers had acted on their own. She gave interviews, she wrote essays, she filed petitions. She watched as the boys who killed her husband walked out of prison, married, had children, and lived their lives. Then in June 2024, in a 4-minute video statement released to the New Hampshire Executive Council, Pamela Smart for the first time accepted responsibility. She said her voice was shaking when she said it. She said she had spent decades deflecting blame as a coping mechanism because the truth of what she had done was too difficult to face. She said that through a writing group in prison, she had finally been forced to acknowledge that she was responsible for her husband's murder. She did not, however, mention Gregory Smart by name in the video. His cousin Val Fryatt told reporters afterward that Pamela had danced around the truth without ever saying what she had actually done. In January 2026, her lawyers filed a fresh petition arguing her conviction should be overturned because of media interference and faulty trial transcripts. The state of New Hampshire continues to oppose every appeal. Gregory Smart's family continues to oppose every parole bid. As of this moment, Pamela Smart will die in prison. Gregory Smart never got to see his 25th birthday. He never had children. He never knew that the woman who promised to love him for the rest of her life had been planning his death for months. He never knew that the last words he heard on this earth came from a frightened 15-year-old boy holding a gun. The condo at 4 Misty Morning Drive eventually changed hands. The dog, Halen, the dog that Pamela had ordered the killers to lock in the basement so it would not be harmed, lived out its life with Gregory's parents. Halen outlived his owner. Pamela Smart will outlive every appeal she has ever filed. The first televised murder trial in American history ended with a wife who used a child to kill her husband, and the ripples from that decision are still being felt 35 years later. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Pamela Smart manipulated a teenager from across a desk, while the next wife on this list took her time, sat next to her husband for years, and slowly fed him poison through a turkey baster while telling everyone she loved him. Case 2. Stacy Caster, the Black Widow with the turkey baster. On the morning of August 22, 2005, a 911 dispatcher in Onondaga County, New York, picked up a call from a woman who sounded panicked. Her name was Stacy Caster. She told the dispatcher that her husband had locked himself in their bedroom for nearly an entire day. He had not eaten. He had not come out. He had not answered her knocks. She said she was scared. She said she did not know what to do. Sergeant Robert Willoughby of the Onondaga County Sheriff's Office arrived at the home in Clay, New York, a quiet suburb of Syracuse. He walked through the house, past the family photographs on the walls, past the comfortable furniture, and up to the closed bedroom door. He knocked. There was no answer. He kicked the door open. What he saw inside the master bedroom would launch one of the strangest and most disturbing murder investigations in the history of upstate New York. David Caster, 48 years old, was lying naked on the bed. He had been dead for hours. The mattress around him was covered in vomit. On the nightstand sat 2 glasses, one of them half full of a bright green liquid. Underneath the bed, sticking out into the room, was a plastic jug of antifreeze with the cap missing. There was no suicide note. There was no firearm in sight, even though David was a hunter who kept a gun in the bedroom. There was no struggle. There was just a body, a green drink, and a wife in the doorway who was now screaming a single sentence over and over again. "He's not dead. He's not dead. He's not dead." He was very much dead. And the woman screaming behind Sergeant Willoughby was the person who had killed him. Stacy Ruth Caster was born Stacy Daniels in Clay, New York, on July 24, 1967. Her parents were Jerry Daniels and Judy Eaton. By the time she was 17 years old, Stacy had already met the man who would become her first husband, Michael Wallace. They started dating in 1984 and married soon after. In 1987, when Stacy was 19, she gave birth to her first daughter, a girl named Ashley. A few years later, the couple had a second daughter, Bree. From the outside, Stacy and Michael looked like any other young family in central New York. Michael had a steady job, the girls were healthy, the household was stable. That was the surface. Underneath, the marriage had been struggling. By the late 1990s, neighbours and family members had heard that Michael wanted out. The exact details of those private fights would eventually matter very much, but in the moment, they were just gossip. Then in January 2000, Michael Wallace died. He was only 38 years old. Stacy told the doctors that her husband had been sick for days, that he was vomiting and feeling drunk even though he had not been drinking. She said he simply collapsed at home. The cause of death was officially listed as a heart attack. Stacy refused to allow an autopsy. The body was buried at Green Lawn Memorial Park Cemetery. Stacy Caster became a widow at 32 years old, and within a year and a half, she had met another man. David Caster was a divorced father with one son from his first marriage. He owned and ran his own air conditioning installation and repair business. He was tall, easygoing, and very wealthy by central New York standards. Stacy, who was working as his office manager, told her friends that David was her Prince Charming. He doted on her. He took her out to nice dinners, bought her gifts, and made her feel safe. They married in 2003. Stacy moved into his home in Clay with her 2 daughters, Ashley and Bree, who were now teenagers. Stacy was 36 years old. David was 46. He had no idea that the woman he had just married had buried her last husband 3 years earlier under suspicious circumstances. The Caster marriage looked happy from the outside. The reality, according to people who worked with the couple, was different. David was the breadwinner and the source of all the money. He had the business, the home, the savings, and a son from his previous marriage who he wanted to leave money to. Stacy was a spender. Money flowed through her hands quickly. She charged things to credit cards. She made changes to the household. She wanted control of the future. In the summer of 2005, that control began slipping. According to investigators who later pieced the timeline together, David Caster had grown frustrated. He had been talking about adjusting his finances. He had been ill on and off for weeks, complaining about feeling sick to his stomach, complaining about not being able to keep food down. Stacy had been mixing him drinks during this period, telling him that they would settle his stomach. The drinks were always cranberry juice, or so she said. Friends of David reported that he kept saying he just wanted the stomach problems to go away. He did not have a stomach problem. He was being slowly poisoned in his own bedroom by his own wife. On the night of August 21st, 2005, David came home and went to bed. Stacy was beside him. At some point that night, according to the prosecution case that would later be presented in court, Stacy gave David another drink mixed with antifreeze. Antifreeze, the green liquid that goes into the cooling system of a car, is sweet to the taste, which is what makes it so dangerous. Animals drink it, children drink it. Once it enters the human body, it begins to break down into substances that destroy the kidneys. Tiny crystals form inside the organs. The crystals do not break down for years, even after death. Antifreeze poisoning is painful, slow, and difficult to recover from once enough has been consumed. David did not die quickly. He vomited. He suffered. The first dose Stacy gave him was not enough to kill him outright, so she went to her kitchen, took out a turkey baster, and used it to force more antifreeze down his throat while he was too weak to fight back. Then she left him there. She let him die alone in their bedroom. The next morning, she called 911 with her panicked story about a husband who had locked himself in. The medical examiner initially agreed with the story Stacy was selling. The death was ruled a suicide by antifreeze poisoning. David, the doctors decided, must have been depressed about his father, who had recently died. He must have decided to end his life by drinking the green liquid in the bedroom. Case closed. It almost worked. The mistake Stacy made was small but fatal. The investigators who came to the house that day looked at the antifreeze bottle and the green glass on the nightstand. They sent both items to the lab to be checked for fingerprints. The fingerprints came back. The only fingerprints on the antifreeze container, on the cap, and on the half-empty glass belonged to Stacy Caster. David's fingerprints were nowhere on any of the items he had supposedly used to kill himself. That was the first crack. Then came the turkey baster. Police searching the kitchen had spotted a turkey baster in the trash can. They pulled it out, looked at the tip, and noticed it smelled faintly of alcohol and something else. They sent it to the lab. The tip of the baster contained traces of antifreeze and David Caster's DNA. The handle had been wiped. None of his DNA was on the part where you grip it. The baster had been used to push fluid into his mouth and then thrown away. By a man who supposedly killed himself. The case became a homicide investigation. Detective Dominic Spinelli of the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department took the lead. He started looking into Stacy's past. He found Michael Wallace, dead at 38 in 2000, and he learned that Stacy had buried Michael right next to David in the same cemetery. The two husbands of Stacy Caster were lying side by side at Green Lawn Memorial Park. Spinelli also discovered that 3 months before Michael Wallace died, Michael had told his doctor he felt drunk, even though he had not been drinking. That symptom, the feeling of drunkenness without alcohol, is a textbook sign of antifreeze poisoning. Investigators went to court and got permission to dig up Michael Wallace's body. The autopsy he had been denied in 2000 was finally performed in 2007. The pathologist looked at his kidneys. They were full of the same crystals found in David Caster's body. Michael Wallace had not died of a heart attack. He had been poisoned with antifreeze, just like David. Stacy had killed him too. The police now had 2 dead husbands, 1 living suspect, and enough evidence to start building a real case. They tapped Stacy's phones. They had her come into the station for an interview. During that interview, Detective Spinelli pressed her gently about the day David died. Stacy tripped over her own words. She said she had poured David some cranberry juice, except she did not say cranberry. She said, and the recording captured this clearly, that she had poured him some antifree. She caught herself. She tried to claim the police had confused her. The interview ended shortly after she saw a photograph of the turkey baster in Spinelli's file. She got up and left. Stacy now knew the police were closing in. Her response was the most disturbing decision she ever made. In September 2007, Ashley Wallace, Stacy's older daughter and Michael Wallace's child, was 20 years old and had just started her first day of college. While Ashley was on campus, 2 detectives approached her and informed her that her father had not died of a heart attack in 2000. They told her his body had been exhumed and that he had been poisoned. They told her he had been murdered. Ashley, devastated, called her mother. The phone call was being recorded by police. Stacy, instead of comforting her daughter, started asking detailed questions about exactly what the police had said. Then she suggested they have a drink together that night to take the edge off. Ashley went home. Stacy mixed her a drink, then another, then another. The drinks contained crushed pills, vodka, orange juice, and Sprite. Ashley drank all of it. She passed out. The next morning she had a hangover, complained about it, and went to school. That same evening, Stacy did it again. This time the drink contained enough crushed pills to be lethal. Ashley collapsed. She would later be found unconscious on her bed. In the early hours of the next morning, Stacy called 911. She said her younger daughter Bree had found Ashley unconscious. She said there was a typed suicide note on Ashley's nightstand. The note, supposedly written by Ashley, was a confession. In it, Ashley admitted that she, not her mother, had killed her father Michael in 2000 and her stepfather David in 2005. The note was Stacy's way of pinning both murders on her own daughter, who would be conveniently dead by the time anyone could check the story. Ashley did not die. The doctors managed to save her after she lay in a coma for 17 hours. When she woke up, she was told what had happened, what the note said, and what her mother had done to her. Ashley Wallace, who was supposed to be a corpse, became the prosecution's star witness. Detectives investigated the suicide note and quickly proved Ashley had not written it. The note had been typed on the family computer in the middle of the night, while Ashley was unconscious. The grammar and writing style did not match Ashley's. Stacy's fingerprints were on the keyboard. The frame-up had failed completely. Stacy Caster was arrested. She was charged with the second-degree murder of David Caster, the attempted murder of Ashley Wallace, and forgery of David's will, which she had altered to cut out his son from his first marriage. She was not charged with Michael Wallace's murder, in part because the evidence on him was older, and the prosecutors believed they had a stronger case using only David and Ashley. Her trial began in January 2009. The prosecution was led by Onondaga County District Attorney William Fitzpatrick and Chief Assistant District Attorney Christine Garvey. They walked the jury through the antifreeze, the fingerprints, the turkey baster with David's DNA only on the tip, the wiretapped phone call where Stacy said antifree by accident, the kidney crystals in 2 dead husbands, and finally, the daughter who survived the suicide setup. Ashley took the stand. She told the jury she had not killed anyone, had not written the suicide note, and had not done anything to her father or her stepfather. She testified against her own mother face to face. The jury convicted Stacy Caster of all charges. On March 5, 2009, she was sentenced to 51 years and 4 months to life in prison. She would not be eligible for parole for over half a century. She was 41 years old when she walked into the New York State prison system. She did not serve all of it. On June 11, 2016, guards at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility found Stacy Caster dead in her cell. The cause of death was a heart attack. There was no foul play. She was 48 years old, the same age David had been when she fed him antifreeze in their bedroom. Her body was sent back to upstate New York, but she was not allowed to be buried near her victims. David Caster's family had his body removed from the cemetery and reburied somewhere else, far away from the woman who had ended his life. Ashley Wallace and Bree Wallace, the 2 daughters Stacy had used and tried to kill, never spoke to their mother again after her conviction. Ashley said in court that she hated her. She did not attend her mother's funeral. The two women had to carry the rest of their lives knowing that the person who gave birth to them had murdered their father, murdered their stepfather, and tried to kill one of them to cover it up. For Stacy Caster, money was the lever. Two husbands had life insurance and assets. Two husbands stood between her and a life of unrestricted spending. She removed both of them with the same household cleaning aisle product, fed to one through a turkey baster while he was too weak to resist. The case made national news. It became the subject of multiple documentaries. The phrase Black Widow followed her name in every headline. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Stacy Caster used poison and a kitchen tool to kill her husbands quietly over years. The next wife on this list reached for something far less subtle when she walked into a bedroom at 5 in the morning with a 5-shot revolver and a key she had stolen from her own daughter. Case 3. Betty Broderick, the socialite who walked in with a stolen key. At 5:30 in the morning on November 5, 1989, the city of San Diego was still asleep. The streets in the wealthy Marston Hills neighborhood near Balboa Park were quiet and dark. The sun had not yet come up. Inside a beautiful home at 1041 Cypress Avenue, two people were sleeping in the master bedroom. One was Daniel Broderick III, a 44-year-old attorney and one of the most successful malpractice lawyers in California. The other was his second wife, Linda Colkina Broderick, who was only 28 years old. They had been married for less than 7 months. They had no idea that a woman with a 5-shot Smith & Wesson revolver was at that very moment letting herself in through the front door, using a key she had taken from her own daughter's purse. The woman climbing the staircase was 42-year-old Elizabeth Ann Broderick, known to everyone as Betty. She was the first wife of the man asleep in the bed upstairs. She was the mother of his 4 children. She had been divorced from him for 2 years. She was carrying a loaded gun. She walked through a house that had once felt like an extension of her own life and made her way up the stairs in the dark. She moved past the open bedroom door, raised the revolver, and fired 5 shots into the bed where the couple lay sleeping. When the smoke cleared, Linda was dead instantly, with bullet wounds to the head and chest. Daniel Broderick had also been hit in the chest and was bleeding badly. He tried to reach for the phone on the nightstand to call for help. Betty walked over to the bed, grabbed the phone out of his hand, ripped it from the wall, and threw it into the hallway out of his reach. He died beside his new wife in the bedroom of the home that had been his sanctuary. Betty Broderick walked out of the house, got back into her car, and drove away. By that afternoon, she would turn herself into police. By the time she did, the case had already become national news. The murder of Daniel and Linda Broderick was not the start of the story. It was the end of one of the most public, most painful, and most expensive divorces in California history. To understand how a 42-year-old mother of 4 ended up walking into a sleeping couple's bedroom with a gun in her hand, the story has to start much earlier, in a much happier place. Betty was born Elizabeth Ann Biseglia on November 7, 1947 in Bronxville, New York. She was the third of 6 children in a strict Italian Catholic family. Her parents owned a successful plastering business. She was raised to value marriage, motherhood, and devotion to her husband above almost anything else. She was a beautiful, smart, ambitious young woman who attended Mount St. Vincent College and graduated with a degree in early childhood education. She met Daniel T. Broderick III in 1965 when she was 17. He was 3 years older. He was studying at the University of Notre Dame and would go on to graduate from Cornell Medical School and Harvard Law School. The combination of degrees was rare. Daniel could have been a doctor, but he chose law instead, specializing in medical malpractice cases, where his medical training gave him an enormous advantage over other attorneys. The two married on April 12, 1969. Daniel was a poor student. Betty supported him. She worked multiple jobs while he finished school. She typed his papers, raised their first children, and lived on a tight budget for years while he built his career. They had 4 children together, 2 daughters and 2 sons. The youngest was their son Danny, born in 1979. By the early 1980s, Daniel Broderick had become one of the most successful attorneys in San Diego. He served as president of the San Diego County Bar Association. He won multi-million-dollar verdicts. He earned an enormous income. The family moved into a beautiful home in the wealthy Coral Reef area of La Jolla. Betty had everything she had been told to want. She had the husband, the 4 children, the mansion, the country club membership, and the social standing. She had spent more than a decade making this possible. She believed her share of the success was guaranteed. Then in the fall of 1982, Daniel hired a 21-year-old woman named Linda Kolkina to be his legal assistant. Linda was a former Delta Airlines flight attendant. She was blonde, attractive, and decades younger than the women normally hired into legal offices. Betty noticed almost immediately. By October 1983, she was certain that her husband was having an affair with the assistant. She confronted him. He denied it. He denied it again. He kept denying it for 2 more years. In February 1985, against Betty's wishes, Daniel moved out of the family home. The marriage was over in his eyes. The legal battle was just beginning. What followed was a divorce so vicious, so drawn out, and so emotionally destructive that it has been studied by lawyers and psychologists for decades. Daniel had every advantage. He was one of the top attorneys in the city. He knew every judge. He knew every divorce lawyer in San Diego. He used those connections to make the divorce extremely difficult for Betty. According to her version of events, every attorney she tried to hire either refused to take the case or eventually withdrew. Daniel was awarded custody of all 4 children. The family home was sold. The marital assets were divided in ways Betty believed were grossly unfair. He was awarded the right to collect fees from her. She was held in contempt of court multiple times. Betty's behavior during the divorce became increasingly unhinged. She left graphic, screaming voicemails on Daniel's answering machine, sometimes hundreds of them. She drove her car through the front door of his new house. She mailed him strange packages. She sent gifts to Linda on what would have been Linda and Daniel's wedding day. She painted accusations on the walls of his home. She abandoned the children at his doorstep one at a time, telling them their father wanted them. She also developed a habit of using extremely vulgar language in front of the children, particularly when she was talking about Linda. The court fined her thousands of dollars per profane voicemail. The custody battle ended with Daniel taking all 4 children. Betty was permitted only limited visits. She would later say in interviews that she felt she had been stripped of everything she had spent her life building, and that no court would listen to her side of the story. The fights moved from custody to money to visitation to fees, and they kept moving for years. On April 22, 1989, Daniel and Linda were married. Linda had been concerned about Betty for a long time. She had urged Daniel to wear a bulletproof vest at the wedding. He refused, but agreed to have plainclothes security present. Betty did not show up. The wedding went ahead without incident. According to Betty, after the wedding, Linda taunted her by sending her cosmetic ads in the mail, advertisements for facial creams and slimming products, suggesting that Betty was old and overweight. Daniel's family disputed those claims later, but Betty believed them deeply. 1 month before the wedding, in March 1989, Betty Broderick walked into a gun shop and bought a Smith & Wesson 5-shot revolver. She told friends she needed it for protection. She kept it in her home. She also continued to call Daniel's house, leave voicemails, and harass the couple in every way the courts would tolerate. The fracture point of Betty's life had stretched out over 6 years. By the fall of 1989, every appeal she had filed had been denied. Every fight she had picked had been lost. She had spent her last savings on lawyers who could not stop the slide. She was paying Daniel court-ordered fees out of her monthly allowance. The children were almost entirely living with Daniel and Linda. The new couple had been married for 6 months. They were moving on. Betty was not. On the night of November 4th, 1989, Betty borrowed her teenage daughter Kim's house key. Kim was the oldest daughter and lived part-time at her father's home. Betty had asked her for the key under some excuse, and Kim had given it to her. That key would unlock the front door of 1041 Cypress Avenue. Betty had also memorized the layout of the new house. She knew exactly where the master bedroom was. She knew exactly where Daniel and Linda would be sleeping. In the early hours of November 5th, Betty drove to her ex-husband's house. She parked outside. She got out of the car. She unlocked the front door with her daughter's key. She climbed the stairs in the dark. She had the loaded revolver with her. According to her later testimony, Daniel and Linda were both asleep in the bed. She walked to the bedroom doorway, raised the gun, and fired 5 times. 3 of the bullets hit the people in the bed. The remaining 2 went into the headboard and the wall. Linda was killed almost instantly. Daniel was wounded badly enough that he could not get up, but he was still conscious. He reached for the phone. Betty grabbed it. She pulled the cord out of the wall. She walked out of the room and out of the house. She drove away. Within hours, Betty called her older daughter and told her something terrible had happened. By that afternoon, she had turned herself into police. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The case became one of the most watched legal battles in California history. Her first trial, in October 1990, ended in a hung jury. The jurors could not agree on whether what Betty had done was first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or manslaughter. Her defense argued that she had been driven to a temporary mental break by years of psychological torture from her ex-husband, who had used the legal system to destroy her. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Kerry Wells, argued that Betty was a calculating killer who had planned everything, taken her daughter's key, bought a gun months in advance, and ripped a phone from a dying man's hand to make sure he could not get help. The hung jury forced a retrial. The second trial began in October 1991. Betty took the stand again. She broke down in tears. She described years of being controlled, manipulated, and punished by Daniel through the courts. She described feeling helpless. She described Linda taunting her. She said that on the morning of the murders, she had not really meant to kill them, that she had only meant to scare them, that she did not even remember firing the shots. The prosecution played her voicemails for the jury. They played the years of harassment. They presented the gun, the key, and the ripped phone cord. They argued that this was a double execution, carried out by a woman who had been planning it for months. On December 10, 1991, the jury came back with their verdict. Betty Broderick was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She smiled in the courtroom as the verdict was read. Her attorney later told reporters that she smiled because she was a social people-pleaser who smiled when she was nervous. Most of the people in the courtroom did not believe him. The judge sentenced her to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life, totaling 32 years to life in California State Prison. Betty Broderick is now 78 years old. She has been in prison since 1989. She has been denied parole multiple times. She was denied in 2010 when the parole board described her as unrepentant and uninterested in taking responsibility. She was denied again in 2017 when prosecutors reported that she smirked through the entire hearing, refused to express remorse, and continued to insist that Daniel had driven her to it. She has been held at the California Institution for Women in Corona for most of her sentence. Her 4 children grew up without either parent. Their father was murdered. Their mother was in prison for murdering him. The 2 oldest, Kim and Lee, testified in the trials about the years leading up to the killings. The 2 youngest, Danny and Rhett, were just children when their world was destroyed. Danny was 10 years old when his father and stepmother were shot. He has spoken publicly about losing his entire family on a single November morning. The case became the subject of 2 CBS television movies starring Meredith Baxter, multiple books, and a 2020 USA Network miniseries. Betty Broderick became a symbol, depending on who was telling the story. To some, she was a battered woman driven over the edge by years of legal abuse from a powerful ex-husband who used the system to break her. To others, she was a wealthy, narcissistic woman who could not stand watching her ex-husband move on with a younger wife and chose murder over moving on with her own life. The truth, like most truths, sits somewhere uncomfortable. Daniel Broderick was, by all accounts, a difficult and arrogant man who used his legal power to crush his ex-wife in court. Betty was, by all accounts, a woman who had spent decades being told her job was to be the perfect wife, and who lost her grip on reality when that role was taken from her. Linda Colkina Broderick was, by every account, just a young woman who married the man she fell in love with. She was 28 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She is buried beside Daniel at Greenwood Memorial Park in San Diego. They share a single headstone. Betty Broderick will likely die in prison. Her next parole hearing remains years away. The condo on Cypress Avenue eventually changed hands. The Broderick children grew up, started their own lives, and have given a handful of interviews over the years. They have all said different things at different times about their mother. None of them can change what happened in the master bedroom on the morning of November 5th, 1989. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Betty Broderick walked through the front door at 5:30 in the morning with a gun and a key and used both. The next wife on this list took her time, used neckties instead, and stabbed her husband 193 times in their own bed before burying him in their backyard. Case 4. Susan Wright, the blue-eyed butcher. On the night of January 13th, 2003, in a quiet subdivision called White Oak Bend in northwest Harris County, Texas, a 26-year-old woman named Susan Wright stood next to her bed and looked down at the body of her husband. Jeffrey Wright, 34 years old, was tied to that bed with neckties around his wrists and ankles. He was naked. He was covered in blood. His face was no longer recognizable. His chest, his stomach, his arms, his legs, even his most private areas had been cut open in dozens upon dozens of places. The tip of one of the kitchen knives Susan had used was broken off and lodged in the top of his skull. She had stabbed him 193 times. The two children she shared with Jeff, a 4-year-old boy and a 7-month-old baby, were asleep in other rooms of the house. The 4-year-old had even woken up during the killing and knocked on the bedroom door asking for his mum. Susan had calmly opened it, walked him back to bed, returned to the master bedroom, and continued stabbing. What she did over the next 6 days would shock the entire state of Texas. What was done to her in court a year later would become one of the most talked about courtroom moments in modern American legal history. The case became known by a single nickname that captured the contrast between the woman accused and the violence she committed. She was the blue-eyed butcher. Susan Lucille Wright was born on April 24, 1976, in Houston, Texas. Her parents were Sue Weller and Jimmy Lawrence White. By the age of 17, she was already working as a topless dancer at a club called Gold Cup in Houston, though she only stayed for a couple of months. She drifted through a few jobs before landing as a waitress at a restaurant in Galveston. She was young, blonde, blue-eyed, and very pretty. In 1997, she met Jeffrey Wright at the restaurant. Jeff was a salesman who installed and serviced commercial carpeting. He was good-looking, well-built, athletic. He was also, by the accounts that would later come out in court, a man with a serious cocaine problem and a long history of violence with the women in his life. He had been engaged once before to a woman named Misty McMichael, who would later say she spent 4 years being beaten and abused by Jeff Wright. None of that information was visible to Susan when they started dating. They married in 1998. Susan was 8.5 months pregnant with their first child at the wedding. Their son, named Bradley, was born almost immediately after. A few years later, the couple bought a small house in the White Oak Bend subdivision. Their second child, a daughter named Kaylee, was born in May 2002. From the outside, the Wrights looked like a normal young Houston family. Inside the home, things were not normal at all. According to what Susan would later testify, Jeff was a different person behind closed doors. He used cocaine regularly. He hit her. He pushed her downstairs. He grabbed her by the throat. He threatened her with knives. He threatened to kill her if she ever tried to leave with the kids. There were marks. There were bruises. Susan never reported any of it to police. She never went to a women's shelter. She never sat down with a friend or a family member and laid out a plan to leave. She kept it all inside while raising 2 small children. The night of January 13th, 2003 started, according to Susan, with one of Jeff's regular cocaine binges. He had been drinking and using. He had come home from a boxing class he was taking. The two of them got into a fight. Jeff, by Susan's account, threw her down on the bed, raped her, and held a knife to her throat. She said they struggled over the knife. She said she got it away from him. She said she stabbed him in self-defense. What happened next is not consistent with any reasonable definition of self-defense. Susan tied her husband to the bed using 2 of his own neckties and a pair of bathrobe sashes. His wrists were tied to the headboard, his ankles were tied to the bedposts. He was naked and stretched out. While she was tying him down, or shortly after, their 4-year-old son Bradley woke up and came to the bedroom door. He knocked. Susan stopped what she was doing, hid the knife, opened the door, walked her son back to his own bedroom, tucked him in, and then returned to the master bedroom. She walked into the kitchen, picked up a second, larger knife, and walked back upstairs. Then she began stabbing. When investigators eventually counted the wounds on Jeffrey Wright's body, the totals were almost beyond belief. He had 41 stab wounds to the face. He had 23 stab wounds to the neck. He had 46 stab wounds to the chest. He had 22 stab wounds to the abdomen. He had 19 stab wounds to the legs. He had 23 stab wounds to the arms. He had 1 stab wound to the back. He had 7 stab wounds to his groin and pubic area. The total came to 193 separate cuts and stabs across his body. One of the knives Susan was using broke during the attack, with the tips snapping off and lodging in the top of his skull. The killing was over by the early hours of the morning. Jeffrey Wright was dead. Susan Wright was alone in a blood-soaked bedroom with her 2 children sleeping nearby, and her dead husband tied to the marital bed. What she did next was where any defense of pure panic and self-defense fell apart completely. Susan untied Jeff's body, dragged it down through the house, and pulled it out into the backyard. There was a hole in the backyard already. Jeff had dug it himself a few months earlier as part of a home improvement project. He had been planning to install a fountain in the spot. The hole was deep, square, and the right size to fit a body. Susan rolled her husband into the hole face down. She covered him with dirt. She came back inside and got to work cleaning. She scrubbed the bedroom carpet. She washed the bedding. She painted over the blood-stained walls of the master bedroom. She got fresh paint and tried to disguise the entire crime scene. She bagged up the murder weapons and other evidence. Then, the next day, on January 14, 2003, Susan Wright drove to a courthouse and filed a domestic abuse report against her husband. She requested a protective order. She wanted documentation in the system showing that she was a battered wife who feared for her safety. The protective order, in her mind, would explain why Jeff was suddenly out of the picture. People would assume he had moved out, fled the area, or was avoiding her. It did not work. Jeff's family started asking questions almost immediately. He had not shown up to work. He had not called his employer. He had not contacted his sister or his parents. He was the kind of man who, according to his family, was always in touch. The disappearance was strange. Susan kept up the act for nearly a week. She told different stories to different people. She told some that Jeff had walked out on her. She told others that he had hit her and run away after she threatened to call the police. She told her own family that he had become violent and disappeared. She kept her 2 small children in the house with the freshly painted bedroom and the fresh grave in the backyard. On January 18, 2003, Susan called her attorney, a man named Neil Davis, and asked him to come to the house. When he arrived, she confessed to him. She told him she had killed Jeff. She told him the body was buried in the backyard. Davis, bound by his duties as her lawyer, but also by his obligations to the court, contacted the Harris County District Attorney's Office and informed them that a body was buried at the Wright home and that his client wanted to turn herself in. The body was recovered from the backyard. The family dog, who had been living in the yard during the days after the killing, had partially dug up the remains and chewed on Jeffrey's left hand. Susan turned herself in at the Harris County Courthouse on January 24, 2003. She was arrested and charged with murder. Her trial began in February 2004. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Kelly Siegler, one of the most famous prosecutors in Texas. Siegler had a reputation for theatrical, unforgettable courtroom performances. The defense was led by attorney Neil Davis, the same lawyer who had taken Susan's confession. Their case rested on a single argument. Susan was a battered wife who had finally snapped after years of abuse. The killing was self-defense. The 193 wounds were the result of trauma, fear, and a complete break from reality, not premeditation. The prosecution had a different theory. They argued that Susan had killed Jeff for money. He had a $200,000 life insurance policy with Susan as the beneficiary. They argued that she had seduced him into the bedroom that night, talked him into letting her tie him to the bed for what he believed would be a sexual encounter, and then attacked him while he was helpless. They argued that the burying, the painting, the false abuse report, and the days of lies were not the actions of a woman who had snapped. They were the actions of a calculating killer who had planned every step. To prove that point, Kelly Siegler did something no one in that Houston courtroom had ever seen before. She had the actual bed from the Wright home brought into the courtroom, the blood-stained mattress. The same bed where Jeffrey Wright had been tied down and stabbed 193 times. Siegler had the bed set up in front of the jury. Then, in front of everyone, in her business suit and high heels, she had a male colleague lie down on the bed. She tied his wrists and ankles to the posts using neckties similar to the ones Susan had used. Then she climbed on top of him, raised one of the actual knives Susan had used, and reenacted the stabbing. She pretended to stab her colleague over and over again. Her colleague struggled at one point because he had a large dip of chewing tobacco in his mouth and could not spit. The neckties were cutting off the circulation in his hands. Kelly Siegler kept going. The reenactment was meant to show the jury that Jeff Wright had not been able to fight back. He had been completely helpless. The wounds had not come from a frantic struggle. They had come from a person sitting on top of a tied-down man and stabbing him until she got tired. The jury watched. The defense objected. The judge allowed it. The image of a prosecutor straddling a tied-down man on a blood-stained mattress in a Texas courtroom was burned into the memories of everyone present. Susan watched the reenactment with tears running down her face. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Susan Wright guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. That was not the end of the legal story. Susan appealed. In 2009, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that her original lawyers had not done a good job representing her during the punishment phase of the trial. They had failed to call witnesses who could have spoken to Jeff's history of abuse. The court ordered a new sentencing hearing. At that second hearing in 2010, Misty McMichael, the woman Jeff had been engaged to before Susan, took the stand. She testified about the years of abuse she had survived from Jeff Wright. The new jury heard her story. They reduced Susan's sentence by 5 years, bringing it down to 20 years total. Susan Wright served roughly 16 years. She was first denied parole in 2014. She was denied again in 2017. In July 2020, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles approved her release. On December 30, 2020, Susan Wright walked out of the Murray unit in Gatesville, Texas, a free woman. She was placed under intense supervision, required to wear a GPS ankle monitor, and ordered to attend anger management counseling until February 2024. She moved in with family in Tomball, Texas. She is now in her late 40s. She has not given a public interview since her release. Her 2 children grew up without either parent. Their father was buried in a backyard. Their mother was buried in a Texas prison. They were raised by Jeff Wright's family, the same family that fought for years to make sure their father's killer never got a lighter sentence than she deserved. The Susan Wright case became a landmark in Texas legal history for several reasons. It led to debates about the limits of courtroom drama. It led to debates about whether a battered wife defense can ever apply when the victim is bound, helpless, and unable to fight back. It led to debates about whether 193 stab wounds can ever be called self-defense. It produced a true crime book, a Lifetime movie, and decades of news coverage. The basic facts of what happened in that bedroom on January 13, 2003 have never been seriously disputed. A 26-year-old wife tied her husband to a bed, stabbed him 193 times, buried him in the backyard, painted over the blood, and then went to court the next day to file fake abuse paperwork to cover her tracks. Whatever else can be said about Jeff Wright's behaviour, What was done to him in that bedroom went so far beyond any rational human reaction that the jury had no choice but to call it murder. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Susan Wright used neckties, 2 kitchen knives, and a freshly dug hole in the backyard. The next wife on this list used something much heavier and much faster. She used a Mercedes in a hotel parking lot, while her stepdaughter sat watching from the passenger seat. Case 5. Clara Harris, the Mercedes murder. On the evening of July 24, 2002, the parking lot of the Nassau Bay Hilton just outside Houston, Texas, was a perfectly ordinary place. Cars came in, cars went out. Hotel guests walked back to their vehicles after dinner or meetings. The Hilton sat right across the highway from the Johnson Space Center, the famous NASA facility. It was a high-end hotel in a wealthy part of the Houston area, the kind of place where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. A silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class 430 was parked in that lot. Behind the wheel was Clara Suarez Harris, 44 years old, a successful dentist, a Colombian immigrant, the mother of 3-year-old twin boys, and the wife of one of the most successful orthodontists in the city. In the passenger seat sat her 16-year-old stepdaughter Lindsay, who was visiting from Ohio. The two of them had been driving around Houston for hours. They had been searching for one specific person. That person was Clara's husband, Dr. David Lynn Harris. He was 44 years old, an orthodontist who, with Clara, owned a chain of successful orthodontic practices across Houston. He was tall, handsome, charismatic, and the father of the twins they had together, as well as Lindsay from his first marriage. He was supposed to be at home that evening. He was, instead, inside the Nassau Bay Hilton with another woman. When David walked out of that hotel, Clara was waiting for him in the Mercedes. What happened in the next 2 minutes was caught on video, played in courtrooms and news broadcasts around the world, and turned a respected dentist into one of the most notorious wives in Texas history. The Nassau Bay Hilton was the same hotel where Clara and David had gotten married 10 years earlier, on Valentine's Day, 1992. Clara Suarez was born in Colombia in 1957. She came to the United States as a young woman with ambition, intelligence, and a strong work ethic. She was named Mrs. Columbia Houston, a beauty pageant title that recognized Colombian women living in the Houston area. She trained as a dentist, learned excellent English, and built a life for herself in Texas. She was, by every account from people who knew her, a kind, charming, hard-working professional. She had earned everything she had. In 1991, she met David Harris. David was an orthodontist, a similar field to her own. They had a great deal in common professionally and personally. David had been married before and had a young daughter named Lindsay from that first marriage. Clara fell in love with him almost immediately. On Valentine's Day in 1992, the two of them got married at the Nassau Bay Hilton in Houston. The hotel was a romantic spot. The wedding was small but happy. Clara joined David's life completely. She accepted Lindsay as her own. She and David built a successful chain of orthodontic offices together. Their professional partnership made them very wealthy. For years, Clara wanted children of her own. She struggled to get pregnant. She and David eventually used fertility treatment to have a baby. The treatment worked beyond their hopes. In 1998, Clara gave birth to twin boys, Brian and Bradley. The Harris family settled into a beautiful estate in Friendswood, a wealthy suburb of Houston. They had the practice, the home, the cars, the kids, the staff. They had a marriage that looked, from the outside, like a model of what a successful couple could become. The fracture came in 2002. David Harris had hired a woman named Gail Bridges as a receptionist at one of their orthodontic offices. Gail was attractive, blonde, and going through a difficult divorce of her own. Sometime in early 2002, David and Gail began an affair. Clara had no idea at first. By the summer, she had started to notice things. David was distant. He was working strange hours. He was distracted at home. He spent more and more time at the office and less time with Clara and the twin boys. In the middle of July 2002, Clara confronted David. She demanded to know if he was having an affair. David admitted it. He admitted he had been seeing Gail Bridges. He told Clara he was sorry. He told her he would end the affair. He even sat down with her and made a strange list on a cocktail napkin, a list of things he liked about Gail compared to Clara. The list included things like Gail's appearance, her energy, and her enthusiasm. The list was meant to help Clara understand what she needed to change to win him back. To anyone reading it from the outside, the list was cruel beyond words. To Clara, it was a roadmap. She decided she would do every single thing on it. She started immediately. She hired a personal trainer to begin working out aggressively. She put a deposit down at a plastic surgeon's office for breast implants. She booked salon appointments. She bought new clothes. She did everything on the napkin list. She believed that if she could become the woman David said he wanted, he would come back to her completely. She also did one more thing. She hired a private investigator. She wanted to make sure David was actually keeping his promise to end the affair. She did not entirely trust him. The investigator's job was to follow David, watch where he went after work, and report back to Clara. The investigator started shadowing David in early July 2002. Within days, the reports came back. David was lying. The affair was not over. He was still meeting Gail Bridges. He had been telling Clara he was working late, while actually spending evenings with the other woman. The investigator had photographs. The investigator was about to gather video evidence too. On the evening of July 24, 2002, Clara was at home with her stepdaughter Lindsay, who was visiting from Ohio for the summer. Lindsay was 16 years old. She had been staying with Clara and David and the twin boys for several weeks. The investigator's office called Clara that evening. They told her David and Gail were together at the Nassau Bay Hilton. They were going to be staying for several hours. The investigator was already there with a camera. Clara made a decision. She got into the silver Mercedes. She told Lindsay to come with her. Lindsay would later testify that Clara, in the days before this evening, had said something chilling to her. She had said that with everything David had done, she could kill him and get away with it. Lindsay did not believe her at the time. She thought it was the kind of thing an angry wife says without meaning it. She got into the car with her stepmother and they drove to the hotel. Clara walked into the lobby of the Nassau Bay Hilton. She found David and Gail Bridges as they were getting off an elevator together. A confrontation broke out in the hotel lobby. Clara screamed at Gail. She grabbed Gail's blouse and ripped it. Hotel staff intervened. The argument moved outside. David and Gail tried to walk to Gail's SUV in the parking lot. Clara walked back to her Mercedes. Lindsay was still in the passenger seat. Clara started the engine. The private investigator was nearby with a video camera, recording everything. The video would later become the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. David and Gail were walking toward Gail's SUV. Clara aimed the Mercedes at them. According to Lindsay's testimony, Clara said the words, "I am going to hit him," just before pressing the accelerator. She gunned the engine. The Mercedes shot forward. The car glanced off Gail's SUV first, knocking Gail out of the way, then struck David head-on. The impact was so violent that David was thrown 25 feet across the parking lot. He hit the pavement hard. Lindsay opened the passenger door and tried to get out. Witnesses said she stuck her feet out as if she was trying to escape the car. Before she could fully get out, Clara turned the steering wheel and put the Mercedes in motion again. She drove the car in a tight circle and drove over David's body where it lay crumpled on the asphalt. The tyres of the heavy luxury sedan rolled directly over him. Clara did not stop. She turned the car around again, crossed two grassy medians, and drove back over him a second time. Then she turned the car around once more and drove over him a third time. When Clara finally stopped the Mercedes, the car was parked on top of David's body. The engine was still running. She put the car in reverse, backed up and got out. David was crushed and dying. Gail Bridges was screaming. The private investigator was still recording. Lindsay was in shock. Clara walked over to David. She knelt down beside him on the pavement. She lifted his head into her lap. She cradled him. She rocked back and forth. Witnesses heard her say, "I am so sorry, David. I am so sorry, David." Over and over, she repeated those words. David Harris died from his injuries a short time later at the hospital. The video taken by the private investigator captured nearly every second of what happened in that parking lot. The first impact, the 25-foot throw, the first run over, the second run over, the third run over. Clara cradling her dying husband. Every frame would be played in court. Clara was arrested at the scene. She was charged with murder. The case became international news within days. British tabloids gave her the nickname the Driller Killer, a play on her job as a dentist. Houston papers ran daily coverage. The video footage was leaked and played on cable news networks for weeks. Court TV planned full coverage of the eventual trial. The trial began in January 2003 in Houston. The prosecution was led by Mia Magnus. The defense was led by an experienced Texas attorney named George Parnham. The defense knew the video was devastating. They could not deny that Clara had run over David. They could not deny she had done it 3 times. Their strategy was to argue that Clara had not intended to kill David. She had intended only to ruin Gail's SUV in a fit of rage. The death of her husband, they argued, was a tragic accident that happened in the middle of a moment of sudden, uncontrolled emotion. The prosecution played the video. They called Lindsay to the stand. Lindsay, then 17 years old, testified against her stepmother. She described the comment Clara had made the week before about being able to kill David and get away with it. She described Clara saying, "I'm going to hit him," in the seconds before the impact. She described watching the entire scene from the passenger seat. She wept on the stand. The prosecution argued Clara had known exactly what she was doing. Texas law gave the jury a specific option. They could convict Clara of murder, but they could also find that she had acted under the influence of sudden passion. A finding of sudden passion would limit the maximum sentence to 20 years in prison instead of life. The defense argued hard for sudden passion. They argued that Clara had just learned moments before the killing that her husband was still cheating on her, that she had just been in a physical altercation in the hotel lobby, and that she had snapped completely. On February 14th, 2003, Valentine's Day, the 11th anniversary of the day Clara and David had married at that very hotel, the jury came back with their verdict. Clara Harris was guilty of murder, but they found that she had acted under sudden passion. The judge sentenced her to 20 years in prison. She was also fined $10,000. Clara was sent to the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas. She served her sentence quietly. She converted school textbooks into a special raised dot system used by blind students, helping them get access to materials they otherwise could not read. She was described by prison staff as a model inmate. Her 2 sons, Brian and Bradley, were placed in the care of family friends. They visited her about once a month. She was not allowed to practice dentistry again because of her felony conviction. She was denied parole twice, in 2013 and 2016. She was finally granted parole in November 2017. On May 11, 2018, Clara Harris walked out of prison. She had served roughly 15 years. She remained on parole with conditions until February 2023. As of today, Clara Harris is no longer under the watch of the Texas criminal justice system. She is in her late 60s. She has not given any major interviews since her release. Lindsay, the stepdaughter who watched it all happen from the passenger seat, has rarely spoken in public about the case since the trial. The twin boys, Brian and Bradley, are now adults. They grew up without a father because their mother killed him in front of his oldest daughter. They visited Clara in prison throughout their childhood. They have largely stayed out of the public eye. David Harris, the orthodontist who built a chain of practices alongside the wife who would eventually kill him, was buried in Houston. The Nassau Bay Hilton parking lot where he died has been repaved and repainted many times since 2002. Hotel guests still pull in and pull out without knowing that one of the most famous murders in Texas history happened on that exact piece of pavement. The video that captured every second of David's last moments is still available, still studied in law schools, and still used as an example of the most damning piece of physical evidence ever brought into a Texas courtroom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Clara Harris took 2 minutes and a heavy luxury car to end her marriage in a hotel parking lot. The next wife on this list took an entire afternoon and an entire luggage set, and the parts of her dead husband would be found floating in the Chesapeake Bay over the course of the following weeks. Case 6. Melanie McGuire, the suitcase killer. On May 5, 2004, 2 fishermen and 2 children were spending a quiet day on the water near the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel in Virginia. The weather was clear, the tide was moving. A dark green suitcase was floating in the water near the 4th artificial island of the bridge tunnel. One of the fishermen reached out and pulled it closer with a hook. The suitcase was heavy, too heavy to be just clothes. They dragged it onto their boat. They opened it. Inside was a pair of human legs. The legs had been cut clean from the rest of a body. They had been wrapped in plastic garbage bags and packed neatly inside the dark green luggage. The fisherman called the police. The bay was searched. 6 days later, on May 11th, a graduate student cleaning up litter on the beach of the Fisherman Island National Wildlife Refuge in Virginia spotted a second suitcase. It was a larger one, part of the same matching set as the first. Inside was a human torso. The torso had been drained of blood and wrapped in plastic. The head had been included. There were 2 bullet wounds, one to the head, one to the chest. A blue blanket from a hospital supply company was wrapped around the head. A few days after that, a third suitcase from the same matching luggage set was found nearby. Inside were the remaining body parts. A dental check confirmed the identity of the dismembered man inside the 3 suitcases. He was William T. McGuire, a 39-year-old computer programmer from Woodbridge, New Jersey, a Navy veteran, a father of 2 young sons. He had been missing for 2 weeks. His wife, a 31-year-old registered nurse named Melanie Lynn McGuire, had reported him missing. She was the last person to have seen him alive. She had told police that her husband had been moody, irritable, possibly unfaithful, and had walked out on the family. She had not, however, told police that her husband had also just signed papers that morning on the first house they would ever own. The case would become known across the country as the suitcase murder. The killer was the wife. The day she killed him was the day they were supposed to start the rest of their lives together. Melanie Lynn Slate was born on October 8, 1972. She grew up in Ridgewood and Middletown Township, New Jersey. She attended Middletown High School South, then went to Rutgers University, where she earned a double major in math and psychology. She graduated from college in 1994. She then enrolled at the Charles E. Gregory School of Nursing. In 1997, she graduated second in her nursing class. She took a job as a nurse at a fertility medicine practice called Reproductive Medicine Associates in Morristown, New Jersey. She met William McGuire at a hospital. Bill, as he was known, was a Navy veteran, smart, charming, and slightly older. He had been born on September 21, 1964. He worked as a computer programmer at the New Jersey Institute of Technology in Newark. The 2 of them married in 1999. They moved into a Woodbridge Township apartment together. Within a few years, they had 2 sons. On the surface, the McGuires looked like a normal young suburban family. Bill went to work, Melanie went to work. The boys grew up. The couple talked about buying a bigger house in a better neighborhood in Warren County, far from the cramped Woodbridge apartment. By early 2004, they were close to making it happen. The fracture in the marriage had started about a year earlier. Sometime in 2003, Melanie McGuire began an affair with one of the doctors at the fertility clinic where she worked. His name was Dr. Bradley Miller. He was married. The relationship was secret, but it became serious. Melanie wanted out of her marriage to Bill. She wanted a future with Bradley Miller. Bill, according to people who knew him, had been drinking more, gambling more, and arguing with Melanie more often. The couple's relationship was visibly strained to anyone paying close attention. April 28, 2004 was supposed to be the happiest day of Bill McGuire's life. He and Melanie went to a closing for the new house in Warren County. They signed the papers. They were officially the owners of their first home. They drove back to the Woodbridge apartment that afternoon. Bill was thrilled. At 5:37 in the evening, he picked up the phone and called the gas company to begin transferring service to the new address. At 5:44 in the evening, he called a close friend to tell him the good news. He said he was so happy he could barely believe it. At 5:59, he called another friend with the same news. He had just bought his family a real home for the first time in his life. He would be dead within hours. Sometime after those phone calls, Melanie drugged Bill. The medical examiner would later find a small amount of a sedative in his system. He was unconscious or close to it when she shot him. She used a .38 caliber revolver. One bullet went into his head, another went into his chest. The killing happened in the bathroom of their Woodbridge apartment, in a building where neighbours lived just feet away on the other sides of the walls. According to the prosecution case that would later be presented in court, Melanie shot Bill while he was either passed out or barely conscious, and then she got to work. She drained the body of blood. She used a saw or a similar tool to cut him into 3 sections. The work would have taken hours. She wrapped each section in plastic garbage bags. She packed each piece into a different suitcase from a matching luggage set she had purchased. She also wrapped the head in a blanket from her workplace, the fertility clinic in Morristown. She did the entire job in the bathroom of the small apartment. She cleaned afterward. She drove the suitcases out to the Chesapeake Bay area in Virginia, hundreds of miles from her home, and dumped them in the water at separate spots, hoping they would never be connected to her. Then she came home. The next day she pretended Bill had walked out on her. She told friends and family that he had become irrational, that he had hit her, that he had stormed out of the apartment after a fight about money and gambling. She filed reports. She made phone calls looking for him. She acted distraught. She did all of this for 2 weeks. The 2 boys had no idea where their father had gone. The first suitcase came out of the bay on May 5th. The body was identified. Police came to the apartment to inform Melanie that her missing husband had been found dismembered in the Chesapeake Bay. She acted shocked. She told them the same story she had been telling everyone, that Bill had walked out on her after a fight, that he had been involved with bad people, possibly mob-connected gambling, and that someone must have killed him. The investigation moved slowly at first. Virginia had jurisdiction because the body had been found there. New Jersey took over the case in October 2004 because the killing had clearly happened in New Jersey. Detectives began going through every detail of Melanie's life. They interviewed her co-workers. They interviewed her friends. They interviewed the doctors she worked with at the fertility clinic. They spoke with Dr. Bradley Miller. The affair came out almost immediately. Bradley Miller cooperated with police. He gave them detailed information about his relationship with Melanie. The investigators found something else. In the weeks before Bill's death, Melanie had used her nursing connections to obtain a prescription for the same sedative that had been found in Bill's body. She had filled the prescription under a false name at a pharmacy. The fake prescription was traced back to her. Then there was the gun. 2 days before the killing, Melanie had driven from New Jersey to a gun store in Pennsylvania. She had purchased a .38 caliber revolver, the same type of weapon that had killed Bill. The purchase records were on file with the gun shop. Then there were the garbage bags. The bags Melanie used to wrap Bill's body were a specific industrial brand. State experts compared the bags found in the suitcases with bags later found in the McGuire apartment. A plastic bag specialist with 27 years of experience testified that the bags from the body and the bags from the home had been made on the same production line within hours of each other. They had come from the exact same package. The blanket wrapped around Bill's head was traced too. The marking inside the blanket showed it had come from a hospital linen supply company called HCSC. That company supplied linens to about 100 medical practices in New Jersey. One of those practices was the fertility clinic in Morristown, where Melanie McGuire worked. The evidence was building into a wall around her. She kept giving interviews. She kept claiming her innocence. She kept performing the role of the grieving widow whose husband had been killed by gambling-connected criminals. The longer she kept it up, the more the holes in her story showed. Police also obtained recordings. Melanie had spoken on the phone with Dr. Bradley Miller and with friends in the days and weeks after the killing. In some of those calls, she made statements that, while not confessions, contradicted other things she had told investigators. The state used those calls to chip at her credibility. In June 2005, more than a year after the killing, Melanie Lynn McGuire was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of her husband. Her trial began on March 5, 2007, at the Middlesex County Courthouse in New Brunswick, New Jersey. The prosecution presented hundreds of pieces of evidence. The fisherman who found the first suitcase took the stand. The graduate student who found the second one testified. The medical examiner described the wounds and the careful dismemberment. The plastic bag specialist explained the manufacturing match. The HCSSC representative explained the blanket. Dr. Bradley Miller testified about the affair, about Melanie's promises to leave Bill, about her plans for a new life with him. The motive presented to the jury was simple. Melanie wanted Bill out of her life. She did not want a divorce because divorce in New Jersey was complicated, expensive, and would have given Bill custody rights to their 2 sons. She wanted to start over, with Bradley Miller, with a clean slate, and with the family she now imagined for herself. The defense argued that Bill McGuire had been involved in dangerous gambling debts. They suggested he had been killed by the people he owed money to. They said the suitcase disposal had been done by criminals who were sending a message. They argued that the prosecution had no direct witness to the killing, no confession, and no physical evidence putting Melanie at the scene of the dismemberment. Melanie did not testify. The jury heard from her only through the recorded phone calls. After 23 days of testimony and roughly 3 days of deliberation, on April 23, 2007, the jury came back with a verdict. Melanie McGuire was guilty of first-degree murder. She was also guilty of perjury, desecration of human remains, and possession of a weapon for an unlawful purpose. She was acquitted on a few lesser counts, including the alprazolam possession charge. On July 19, 2007, Melanie McGuire was sentenced. The judge gave her life in prison, plus an additional 5 years for the related charges. Under New Jersey's No Early Release Act, she must serve at least 63 years and 9 months on the murder charge alone before she becomes eligible for any kind of parole consideration. Her total sentence means she will not be considered for parole until she is 101 years old. She was 34 years old when she walked into the New Jersey state prison system. She is currently held at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women in Clinton, New Jersey. She has appealed her conviction multiple times. Every appeal has failed. The most recent attempts at a new trial were rejected by the courts after she briefly tried to argue that a jailhouse informant had given her a tip suggesting Bill had been killed by mob figures. The informant was eventually proven to be a serial liar. The story collapsed. Her conviction stands. Melanie's 2 sons were toddlers when their father was killed. They had no real memory of him. They were raised by Bill McGuire's family after their mother was sent to prison. They grew up knowing their father had been cut into pieces and their mother had done it. They are now adults. Bill McGuire never spent a single night in the new house he and Melanie had bought. The closing papers had been signed that morning. He had called his friends to share the good news that very evening. The mortgage was real. The deed was real. The future they had planned for their 2 boys was real. None of it ever got to happen, because the woman who had signed those papers next to him had already bought a gun, already obtained a sedative, already chosen her matching luggage, and already decided that the man who had just become a homeowner with her was going to be dead before sunrise. The case became the subject of multiple true crime documentaries and books. A Lifetime movie called Suitcase Killer, The Melanie McGuire Story, was released in 2022 and began streaming on Netflix in early 2026. Each retelling has brought new audiences to the same shocking facts. A nurse, a perfect resume, a small apartment, a new house, a bathtub, 3 suitcases, a bay. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Melanie McGuire used a saw, a sedative, and a luggage set to remove her husband from her life on the day he should have been celebrating. The next wife on this list did not get her hands dirty at all. She handed her husband off to her lover, told the lover he was an abusive monster who needed to die, and watched while the other woman pulled the trigger. Case 7. Celeste Beard, the gold digger who outsourced murder. At around 3:30 in the morning on October 2, 1999, in a quiet, wealthy neighborhood called Westlake Hills, just outside Austin, Texas, a phone call came into the local emergency line. The voice on the other end was a 75-year-old man. He sounded confused. He sounded like he was in pain. He told the dispatcher his guts had jumped out of his stomach. He said they had blown out. He said they were lying on his stomach right in front of him. He said he did not know what had happened. He said he had never had this happen before. The man making that call was Stephen Beard. He was a retired television executive. He was a self-made multimillionaire with a personal fortune of roughly $12 million. He had been asleep in his own bed, in his own home, in his own quiet neighborhood, when, moments before the call, someone had crept into his bedroom and shot him in the stomach with a 20-gauge shotgun. Stephen did not know any of that yet. He could not figure out what had happened to him. He just knew he was hurt and he needed help. His 36-year-old wife, Celeste Beard, was somewhere else in the house at that exact moment with her teenage daughter Jennifer. The house was a sprawling estate. Celeste did not call 911 herself. Stephen did, alone, from his bed. The police arrived within minutes. The first officer at the scene rang the doorbell. He banged on the door. No one answered. He walked around to a back window, peered inside, and saw Stephen lying badly injured on his bed. He broke through a sliding glass door to get inside. As officers entered, Celeste and Jennifer emerged from another wing of the building, acting as if they had just woken up. The officers found a spent 20-gauge shotgun shell near the bed. They saw that the drawers in a bathroom had been pulled out and rummaged through, the way a burglar might leave a room. Most of the valuables in the house, however, had not been touched. The story was supposed to look like a robbery gone wrong. It would not stay looking that way for very long. Celeste Beard had not pulled the trigger. She had her lover do it. The lover was a woman she had met in a mental health hospital. The motive was money, $12 million of it. Celeste was born Celeste Johnson on February 13, 1963. She did not know her biological parents. She was adopted as a baby by a man named Edwin Johnson, whom she would later accuse of physically and sexually abusing her throughout her childhood. She had a difficult, painful upbringing by her own account, attempted suicide as a teenager, and got pregnant at 17 with twin daughters by her first husband, a man named Craig Bratcher. Bratcher would later die by suicide in 1996. Celeste's twin daughters, Christina and Jennifer, were teenagers by the time she met Stephen Beard. Celeste was already on her fourth husband when she became Mrs. Beard. She had married twice more between Bratcher and Stephen. She was a beautiful, charming, smart woman with two daughters and a clear plan for her future. The plan involved finding a man who could give her the lifestyle she felt she deserved. She met Stephen in 1993 while working as a waitress at the Austin Country Club. Stephen was a member there. He was 70 years old. He was a former Navy man who had attended Texas Christian University and Southern Methodist University, then built a long career in radio, advertising, and television. He had eventually become a partner co-owner of KBVO, a Fox network television station in the Austin area. By the time Celeste met him, he had retired with a personal fortune of $12 million. His first wife, Elise, had been ill with cancer for some time. She passed away in October 1993. Within months of Elise's death, Stephen was in a serious relationship with Celeste. Stephen's adult children were horrified. Stephen and Celeste married on February 18, 1995. He was 71, she was 32. He told friends he was going to legally adopt her twin daughters, which he eventually did. The Beard family suspected from the beginning that Celeste had married Stephen for his money. Their suspicions would turn out to be exactly correct. The marriage from the very start was about Celeste's spending. Their household budget was an estimated $35,000 a month. Celeste blew through it. She told ABC News years later that they had a budget that high and that she was spending much more than that. She redecorated. She travelled. She bought designer clothes. She filled the home with new things. Stephen became increasingly uncomfortable with the financial bleeding. The two of them began arguing about money. He threatened her with divorce more than once. They went to therapy together. The marriage limped on. In February 1999, Celeste was admitted to a psychiatric hospital called St. David's Pavilion in Austin. She had been struggling with depression. The official reason for the admission was treatment. While she was in the hospital, she met another patient. The other patient was a woman named Tracy Tarleton. Tracy was the manager of Austin's largest independent bookstore, Book People. She was openly lesbian. She had been admitted for treatment of bipolar disorder. The two women became close almost immediately. After both were released, the relationship continued and intensified. According to Tracy's later testimony, she and Celeste began a sexual and romantic relationship. They saw each other constantly. They had dinners together. They went out together. People around them noticed. Celeste's daughters, Christina and Jennifer, would later say they had seen their mother and Tracy kiss. Stephen himself, according to court testimony, had once seen Tracy try to kiss Celeste at a barbecue and had thrown Tracy out of the house. Celeste denied to Stephen and to everyone else that the relationship was anything more than a friendship. She kept telling Tracy something different in private. She told Tracy that her marriage to Stephen was a nightmare. She told Tracy that Stephen was emotionally abusive. She told her that he was slowly destroying her. She told her that the only way they could be together was if Stephen were dead. Tracy was, by every account from people who knew her, deeply in love. She was also vulnerable, mentally ill, and unstable. She believed Celeste. She believed Stephen was a monster who needed to be removed from her lover's life. Celeste pushed and pushed. According to the prosecution case that would later be presented in court, Celeste suggested over and over that Tracy use her own gun to kill Stephen. Tracy owned a 20-gauge shotgun that her father had given her. She used it for skeet shooting. Celeste suggested that Tracy could enter the house, find Stephen asleep, and shoot him. Celeste herself would help. She would turn off the burglar alarm. She would leave the bedroom door unlocked. All Tracy had to do was come in and pull the trigger. By the fall of 1999, Stephen and Celeste had been talking about an extended trip to Europe. They were planning to leave on October 2nd. The fights had calmed somewhat. Stephen had perhaps started to believe his marriage might be savable. In the early hours of that very October 2nd morning, the morning they were supposed to fly to Europe, Tracy Tarleton drove to the Beard home. The alarm was off. The bedroom door was unlocked. She walked through the house. She found Stephen asleep in the master bedroom. She raised her 20-gauge shotgun and fired one shot into his stomach at close range. Then she walked out, got back in her car, and drove home. Stephen did not die from the shot. He woke up. He did not understand what had happened. He picked up the phone himself and called 911 with the bewildering, devastating description of his own injury. He did not know he had been shot. He had just woken up to a hole in his abdomen. Stephen survived emergency surgery. He was hospitalized for nearly 4 months. Celeste played the role of the devoted, worried wife. She visited him constantly. She made sure he was being cared for. The Beard family lawyer, David Cooperman, refused to allow police to interview Stephen while he was in such poor condition. Investigators were left waiting. Police started looking at Tracy Tarleton because the spent shotgun shell at the scene was traceable. The shell was a 20-gauge. Tracy was known to own a 20-gauge shotgun. They went to her home. They tested her gun. The ballistics matched. Tracy confessed to firing the shot. She was arrested on October 8, 1999, just 5 days after the shooting, and charged with assault. She did not, in that first confession, mention Celeste at all. She took the blame entirely on herself. She told police she had acted alone, that she had been obsessed with Celeste, and that she had decided on her own that Stephen was an obstacle. For nearly 4 months, Stephen Beard slowly recovered in the hospital. He was finally released in late January 2000 and returned home to Celeste's care. One day after coming home, he was readmitted to the hospital with a severe infection. The infection had developed at the site of his gunshot wound. On January 22, 2000, Stephen Beard developed a blood clot related to his injuries and died. He was 75 years old. The charge against Tracy Tarleton was upgraded from assault to capital murder. Celeste played the grieving widow in public. In private, according to her own daughter Jennifer's later testimony, she was relieved. Jennifer told ABC News years later that Celeste had laughed a lot in the days after Stephen's death, in a way that suggested she was happy he was no longer around. Within 6 months, Celeste had married again. Her 5th husband was a man named Cole Johnson. The marriage to Cole was the public final insult to Tracy Tarleton. Tracy, sitting in jail awaiting trial for capital murder, read about Celeste's new marriage in a local newspaper. The realization that Celeste had used her, manipulated her, lied to her, and discarded her hit Tracy hard. Tracy contacted detectives. She told them she wanted to tell the truth. She told them an entirely new story. She told them the murder had been Celeste's idea from the beginning. She told them about the alarm being turned off, the door being left unlocked, the months of pressure, the lies about Stephen being abusive. She agreed to testify against Celeste in exchange for a reduced sentence. Celeste Beard was arrested in March 2002. She was charged with capital murder under a Texas legal rule called the law of parties, which makes someone equally guilty if they help plan or arrange a murder, even if they did not pull the trigger. She pleaded not guilty. She kept claiming throughout the entire pre-trial period that Tracy Tarleton was a delusional stalker who had killed Stephen entirely on her own. The trial began in early 2003 in Travis County, Texas. Tracy Tarleton was the prosecution's star witness. She told the jury about meeting Celeste at the psychiatric hospital. She told them about the relationship. She told them that Celeste had asked her over and over to kill Stephen. She told them she had loved Celeste and that she now realized she had been used. She testified that Celeste had told her she loved her and that she had spent considerable time making Tracy believe their future depended on Stephen's death. Then came the most devastating witnesses for the prosecution. Celeste's own twin daughters, Christina and Jennifer Beard, took the stand against their mother. They testified that they had seen their mother kiss Tracy Tarleton. They testified about their mother's behavior in the days after the shooting. The defense tried to paint the daughters as greedy young women who were testifying so they could inherit Stephen's estate. The jury did not buy it. The most damaging single piece of evidence may have been an audio recording in which Celeste was caught on tape telling Christina, "I hired somebody to kill Tracy." The recording suggested that Celeste, after the murder, had attempted to arrange the killing of the only person who could fully expose her. On March 19, 2003, the jury found Celeste Beard Johnson guilty of capital murder. The prosecution had not sought the death penalty, so the sentence was a mandatory life term. Under Texas law, she must serve at least 40 years before becoming eligible for parole. She will be 79 years old when she first becomes eligible, in April 2042. Tracy Tarleton, in exchange for her cooperation, was sentenced to 20 years. She served roughly 10 years and was paroled in August 2011. She returned to Texas and has lived a quiet life since her release. Celeste Beard, now in her early 60s, is still incarcerated at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Lane Murray Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She continues to insist she is innocent. In interviews from prison, including a 2024 conversation with Snapped Behind Bars, she has continued to claim that Tracy Tarleton acted alone, that her daughters lied to inherit money, and that the entire criminal case against her was based on the obsessions of a mentally ill woman. The legal record disagrees. Every appeal she has filed has failed. She was denied any inheritance from Stephen's estate. The money went to his blood children and to her 2 daughters, who he had legally adopted. Stephen Beard's children gave statements at her sentencing. His son, Stephen Beard III, told her he hoped she would burn in hell. Her own daughter Christina told her she had violated her stepfather, lied to the family, and murdered the man who had given them everything. Christina ended her statement with 2 words: "Shame on you." Celeste Beard never pulled a trigger. She turned a vulnerable woman into a weapon, pointed her at her elderly husband, and then watched her former lover go to prison, while she walked free, for 2.5 years before the truth came out. The case was the very first episode of the Oxygen Channel's true crime series Snapped, the foundational case that defined the entire format of that show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Celeste Beard used another woman's hands and another woman's gun to kill her millionaire husband. The next wife on this list did something even more impressive in its cruelty. She used a stranger she had only met online, manipulated him with fake pregnancies and painted on bruises, and convinced him to drive 800 miles across America to shoot a man he had never met. Case 8. Sheree Miller, the Internet Black Widow. On the evening of November 8, 1999, in a small town called Mount Morris, just outside Flint, Michigan, a man named Bruce Miller had not come home from work. His wife, 28-year-old Sheree Miller, was getting worried. Bruce was the kind of man who kept regular hours. He owned and ran a junkyard called B&D Auto Parts. He drove home every evening. He was a creature of habit. By 6 in the evening, he should have been pulling into the driveway. Sheree called her brother-in-law Chuck, Bruce's brother. She asked Chuck if he could drive down to the junkyard and check on Bruce. Maybe Bruce had gotten stuck on a job. Maybe his truck had broken down. Maybe one of the dogs at the yard had needed attention. Chuck agreed and drove over. When Chuck pulled into the parking lot at the junkyard, everything looked normal. The lights were still on inside the small office building. The dogs were quiet. Bruce's truck was parked in its usual spot. Chuck walked up to the office door. He pushed it open. He stepped inside. His brother was on the floor in a pool of blood. Bruce Miller had been shot once at close range with a 20-gauge shotgun. The blast had hit him in the neck and upper chest. The phone receiver was on the floor next to his body. He had been dead for hours. Chuck called the police. Within minutes, the small office was filled with sheriff's deputies. The first thing the police noticed was that Bruce's wallet was missing. Bruce was known to keep up to $2,000 in cash in his front shirt pocket, so he could buy car parts on the spot from sellers who walked in. The cash was gone. The wallet was gone. The killing looked, on the surface, like a robbery that had gone bad. A scrap dealer with cash on him, shot for the money, no witnesses, no leads. Police asked Sheree for help right away. She gave them a name almost immediately. She told them about an ex-boyfriend named John Hutchinson, who used to work for Bruce. She told them John owed Bruce several $1,000s. She told them John was a dangerous man with a history of trouble. She suggested he might have been the one. The investigation focused on Hutchinson. He failed a polygraph test. The police questioned him hard. They could not make a case stick. The evidence was simply not there. Months passed. The case went cold. The truth was that John Hutchinson had nothing to do with Bruce Miller's death. The man who shot Bruce had been hundreds of miles away one day earlier and would be hundreds of miles away the day after. He had never met Bruce. He had never stepped foot in Michigan before that week. He had been driven to that junkyard by lies whispered to him over an internet connection by the wife who had just suggested someone else as the killer. Sheree Paulette Kitley was born on October 13, 1971. She grew up in Michigan. She married young and had 3 children from previous relationships before she met Bruce. By the late 1990s, she was a 27-year-old single mother working as a bookkeeper, trying to find some kind of stable footing. She also did some side work selling Mary Kay cosmetics. She was a chatty, outgoing, attractive woman who got along with almost everyone. In late 1998, Sheree took a bookkeeping job at Bruce Miller's junkyard. Bruce was 49 years old. He had been divorced twice. He was looking forward to a quiet retirement. He was a NASCAR fan, a man who liked routine, a man who friends described as quiet and decent. He met Sheree at work and was charmed. She was 20 years younger than he was. The age gap and the boss-employee dynamic did not stop them from dating. By April 1999, only a few months after they had started seeing each other, they were married. Both brought children from previous marriages. Bruce was, on paper, the most stable thing that had happened to Sheree in years. The fracture in their marriage started right around the time the wedding ended. Sheree was already cheating on Bruce. She had a side life that her new husband did not know about. She had developed an obsession with America Online chat rooms. AOL in 1999 was a kind of early social network. People logged in, joined themed chat rooms, and talked to strangers. Sheree was online almost constantly. She had multiple male admirers she chatted with. She sent them messages. She sent some of them photographs. In May 1999, less than a month into her marriage to Bruce, Sheree struck up a conversation in an AOL chat room with a man calling himself Bad Cop. The man behind the screen name was Jerry Cassidy. Jerry was a 45-year-old former police lieutenant from Kansas City, Missouri. He had spent years on the police force in charge of homicide investigations. He had been married, had a son, and had built a respectable career. Then his life had fallen apart. He had injured himself at work, become addicted to prescription painkillers, lost his job after clashing with a powerful sheriff, gotten divorced, and ended up working at a casino in Reno, Nevada, before relocating again to Kansas City. By the time Sheree met him online, Jerry Cassidy was depressed, lonely, financially stressed, and emotionally fragile. Sheree saw all of this. She moved in fast. The chats turned sexual within days. She sent Jerry naked photos. She told him she was unhappily married to a violent, abusive man named Bruce. She told him Bruce was tied to organized crime. She told him Bruce had connections to the mob. She told him Bruce hit her and threatened her. She sent him photographs of bruises. The bruises in those photographs, investigators would later prove, were painted on with cosmetics. Sheree was a Mary Kay representative. She knew how to use makeup to fake injuries. Jerry believed everything. He flew to Michigan multiple times to meet her. They had a physical affair. He fell deeply in love. He told his co-workers and his mother that he had finally met the woman of his dreams. The woman of his dreams told him that her cruel, mob-connected husband would never let her go. Then Sheree added a new detail to her story. She told Jerry she was pregnant. She said the baby was his. She sent him a sonogram photograph as proof. The sonogram was real, but it was years old. It was actually a sonogram from one of Sheree's previous pregnancies with one of her older children. Jerry never thought to check the date or the patient information. He was overjoyed. He told his mother he was about to be a father again. Then came the worst lie of all. Sheree called Jerry one day, sobbing. She told him Bruce had found out about the pregnancy. She told him Bruce had attacked her, kicked her in the stomach, and caused her to lose the baby. She told Jerry she had miscarried because of her violent husband. Jerry Cassidy was destroyed. The man who, weeks earlier, had been picturing a future with Sheree and a new baby, was now being told that his unborn child had been murdered by the woman's husband. From that moment on, in Jerry's mind, Bruce Miller was a monster who deserved to die. Sheree, gently and carefully, fed that idea over the next several weeks of online messages. She told Jerry that Bruce would never stop. She told him Bruce would kill her too eventually. She told him the only way they could be safe and be together was if Bruce were gone. She told him she could not leave because Bruce would find her and hurt her or her children. She told him she needed him to come and help her. The plan came together in chats and instant messages over the course of the fall of 1999. Jerry would drive from Kansas City to Michigan. He would shoot Bruce at the junkyard. They would make it look like a robbery. Sheree would inherit the business, the home, and Bruce's assets. Jerry and Sheree would build a life together with the freedom that Bruce's death would give them. On November 7th, 1999, Jerry Cassidy drove from Kansas City to Michigan. He stopped at a rest area off the interstate. Sheree met him there. She handed him a cell phone, a map, and final instructions on where to find Bruce and how to enter the junkyard. The next afternoon, November 8th, 1999, Jerry Cassidy walked into B&D Auto Parts. He approached Bruce, who was alone in his small office. Bruce did not know him. Bruce had no reason to be afraid. Jerry pulled a 20-gauge shotgun, raised it, and fired one shot into Bruce's neck and upper chest at close range. Bruce died almost instantly. Jerry took Bruce's wallet to make it look like a robbery. He left. According to Sheree's later admission, Jerry called her landline phone after the shooting and let it ring just once before hanging up. The single ring was a pre-arranged signal. It meant the job was done. Jerry was on his way back to Kansas City. Sheree called her brother-in-law a few hours later, right on schedule, and the cover story rolled out exactly as planned. The case looked like it might never be solved. Then, 3 months later and 700 miles away, the investigation cracked open from the most unexpected direction. In February 2000, Jerry Cassidy took his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot. The depression and the substance abuse problems that had plagued him for years had not been cured by his relationship with Sheree. They had been made worse. Before he killed himself, Jerry made one final decision. He left a briefcase behind for his family. He had also left a suicide note. Jerry Cassidy had been a homicide investigator for years. He knew exactly how to preserve evidence. The briefcase he left behind contained the printed transcripts of every chat he had ever had with Sheree. It contained the false sonogram. It contained letters. It contained printouts of their plans. It contained references to the Michigan murder. It contained, in plain English, a written record of an adulterous wife pressuring a vulnerable, mentally ill man into killing her husband for her benefit. Jerry's brother turned the briefcase over to police. Investigators in Michigan also discovered, in Jerry's trash at the home where he had killed himself, 2 VHS tapes. One was labelled "For Jerry's Eyes Only." It contained sexually explicit recordings of Sheree. Another contained additional materials connecting them. Sheree was arrested in February 2000. She was charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and second-degree murder. The trial began in December 2000 at Genesee County Circuit Court in Flint, Michigan. The case made national headlines. It was one of the first major American murder cases where the central evidence consisted of internet chat logs. Lawyers argued in court about whether AOL transcripts could even be admitted as evidence. The judge ruled they could. The prosecution presented the chats. They showed how Sheree had built a fake reality for Jerry over months. They showed the painted-on bruises. They showed the recycled sonogram. They showed the lies about the mafia. They showed the lies about the miscarriage. They showed Jerry's slow descent from infatuated lover to remote-controlled killer. The defense tried to argue that John Hutchinson had been the actual shooter, but no jury was going to believe that theory after seeing the briefcase. The defense also argued that the chat transcripts had been hacked or altered, that Jerry had stalked Sheree, and that the tape had been blackmail. None of it stuck. On December 22, 2000, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury found Sheree Miller guilty on all charges. On January 29, 2001, Genesee County Circuit Court Judge Judith Fullerton sentenced her to life in prison for conspiracy to commit murder, plus 54 to 81 years for second-degree murder. The case was not finished there. In August 2008, a federal judge overturned Sheree's conviction on the grounds that Jerry Cassaday's suicide note should not have been admitted at trial because Jerry was dead and could not be cross-examined. She was ordered released on bond in July 2009 and was briefly free for a few hours before being rearrested on the same charges. The federal courts later reversed themselves. In August 2012, the Federal District Court ruled that the suicide note had been reliable enough to satisfy her constitutional rights, and her convictions were reinstated. In February 2014, the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit upheld her convictions and her sentence. In 2016, Sheree Miller did something her defense team had spent years insisting she would never do. She wrote a 4-page typed letter to Judge Fullerton from prison. In the letter, she admitted her role in her husband's death. She admitted she had manipulated Jerry. She admitted she had lied about the bruises. She admitted she had lied about the pregnancy and the miscarriage. She admitted she had pressured Jerry into the murder. The admission came too late to change anything. She was already incarcerated. The prosecution and the courts had already won every battle. Sheree Miller is now in her mid-50s. She is still serving her sentence. She has filed multiple motions for relief over the years, and every one of them has been denied. The most recent denial came in August 2017. Bruce Miller's children grew up without their father. Jerry Cassaday's son grew up without his father too. The case became a defining moment in the history of how the internet would be used as evidence in criminal trials. Forensic experts and prosecutors still teach the case as an example of how online manipulation can be just as deadly as a face-to-face conspiracy. A 28-year-old woman in Michigan, sitting at a computer in her own home, had used a chat room and some makeup to convince a stranger 700 miles away to kill her husband for her. The technology was new. The crime was as old as marriage itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sheree Miller used a stranger's loneliness and a chat room to remove her husband from her life. The next wife on this list took something even slower and more patient. She and her lover spent 17 years convincing the world that her husband had been eaten by alligators, while his body sat buried in a shallow grave 60 miles away. Case 9. Denise Williams, the 17-year cold case. In the early hours of December 16, 2000, two men launched a small boat onto the cold, dark waters of Lake Seminole on the Florida-Georgia border. The duck hunting season had just opened. The two men were lifelong best friends. They had grown up together, gone to the same high school, and stood up at each other's weddings. Their wives were also best friends. The man behind the wheel was Brian Winchester, 31 years old, an insurance salesman. The man in the passenger seat was Mike Williams, also 31, a property appraiser. The plan that morning was the same as every other trip. Get out on the water, set up the decoys, wait for the ducks, come home. That was the plan Mike Williams understood. Brian Winchester had a different plan. Brian was going to kill Mike that morning. He had been planning it for months. He had picked the lake because the water was cold, the area was remote, and an open lake at dawn would explain a missing body better than almost any other place. Mike Williams would never come home. His disappearance would baffle Florida police for 17 years. The official theory, repeated for nearly 2 decades, was that he had fallen out of his boat in the dark, gotten tangled in his hunting gear, and been eaten by alligators. The community of Tallahassee accepted that story. The truth was that Brian Winchester pushed Mike out of the boat at gunpoint, shot him in the face when the cold water did not finish him off, and buried him 60 miles away in a shallow grave. The truth was that the entire plan had been put together with the help of Mike's wife, Denise Williams, who had been having an affair with her husband's best friend for years. Denise Williams was born on October 24, 1969, in Tallahassee, Florida. She and Mike were high school sweethearts at Leon High School. They married in 1994. By 1999, they had had their first child, a daughter named Ansley. Mike worked as a property appraiser. He was, by every account, a devoted husband, a loving father, and a kind man with a quiet sense of humor and a strong religious faith. The fracture in his marriage had begun without him noticing. His wife had started sleeping with his best friend in 1997, 3 years before the murder. Brian Winchester and Mike had been so close that Brian was a regular fixture at the Williams family home. Brian's wife Kathy was Denise's best friend. The four of them travelled together, ate dinners together, vacationed together. Mike never suspected. The plan to kill Mike came together in 1999 and 2000. Brian and Denise wanted to be together. They did not want a divorce because divorce would have meant splitting custody and money. They wanted Mike out of the way completely. There was a powerful added motivation. Brian Winchester sold insurance for a living. In the months before the killing, he had sold Mike a $1 million life insurance policy. Mike had agreed to it as part of normal family planning. He had no idea that the man writing the policy had been sleeping with his wife. On the morning of December 16, 2000, Mike kissed Denise and his young daughter goodbye and got into Brian's truck. They launched the boat in the dark. The temperature was just above freezing. According to Brian's later courtroom testimony, he drove the boat into deeper water and then produced a handgun. He pointed it at Mike. He told Mike to get out of the boat. The plan had been that the cold water and the heavy hunting gear would drown him. The plan failed. Mike did not drown immediately. He was a strong man. He was wearing a flotation device under his outer hunting layers. He stayed at the surface. He swam. He cried out. He begged Brian for his life. Brian had not planned for this. He grabbed his 12-gauge shotgun. As Mike swam in the freezing water, looking up at his best friend in the boat, Brian aimed and fired. The blast hit Mike in the face at close range. Mike Williams died in the water at Lake Seminole. Brian then changed plans on the spot. He pulled Mike's body out of the water, loaded it into the back of his truck, and drove roughly 60 miles back toward Tallahassee. He stopped near a small remote lake called Carr Lake. He dug a shallow grave and rolled Mike into it. Denise played her role perfectly. She filed the missing person report. She gave interviews to local news. She cried at the right moments. After the legally required waiting period, she petitioned the court to have Mike declared legally dead by accidental drowning. The court agreed. She collected approximately $1.75 million in life insurance, including the $1 million policy Brian had sold to Mike personally. In 2005, Denise Williams and Brian Winchester got married. To anyone who looked at them, the situation was easy to explain. Two old friends had bonded over the loss of Mike. Tallahassee accepted the new normal. The marriage between Denise and Brian did not last. By 2016, they were divorced. In August 2016, Brian Winchester did something that ended up cracking the case wide open. He hid in the back seat of Denise's vehicle and waited for her. When she got in, he held a gun on her, kidnapped her, and drove her around for hours, demanding that she return to him. Denise managed to escape and called the police. Brian was arrested. Sitting in jail facing a possible life sentence for the kidnapping, Brian made a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for immunity from murder charges, he would tell them what really happened to Mike Williams in 2000. He would lead them to the body. He would testify against Denise. The deal was made. In December 2017, exactly 17 years after Mike's disappearance, his remains were found near Carr Lake. The wedding ring he had been wearing the morning he died was still on his finger. The dental records confirmed the identification. The skull showed the shotgun damage. Denise Williams was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. Her trial began in December 2018 at the Leon County Courthouse in Tallahassee. Brian Winchester was the prosecution's star witness. He told the jury everything. The most devastating moment of the trial came during closing arguments. State Attorney John Fuchs reached into his pocket. He pulled out something small. He placed Mike Williams' wedding band in front of the jury. The same ring that had been on his finger when Brian forced him into the freezing water. The same ring that had stayed on his finger as his body lay in the shallow grave for 17 years. Mike's mother, Cheryl Williams, also gave a victim impact statement. She told the court that Denise had not only killed her son, she had stolen her granddaughter, raised her in the home of the man who had murdered her father, and lied to all of them for nearly 2 decades. On December 14, 2018, the jury convicted Denise Williams of all charges. She was sentenced to life in prison. The conviction did not survive completely intact. In November 2020, the Florida 1st District Court of Appeal reversed the first-degree murder conviction. The judges ruled that Denise had not personally aided, abetted, hired, or directly procured the killing in a way that met the strict legal definition under Florida law. The conspiracy and accessory after the fact convictions stood. She was resentenced on the conspiracy charge in September 2021 and given the maximum 30 years. The Florida Supreme Court refused to review the case. Denise Williams is now in her mid-50s, serving her 30-year sentence in the Florida prison system. Brian Winchester remains in prison, serving his 20-year sentence for the kidnapping. They will both be elderly by the time they are released. They have not spoken to each other since the trial. Ansley Williams, the daughter Mike never got to watch grow up, became an adult while her mother sat in prison for arranging her father's death. For 17 years, Tallahassee believed alligators had taken Mike Williams. For 17 years, Mike's mother lit candles, prayed, and asked God for an answer. For 17 years, Denise Williams collected the insurance money, raised Mike's daughter, and slept beside the man who had pulled the trigger. The wedding ring on his finger was the closest thing the case had to a witness. It waited under 6 feet of dirt for nearly 2 decades for someone to dig it up and tell its story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Denise Williams used patience, lies, and 17 years of cold silence to bury her husband and her secret. The next wife on this list went the opposite direction. She killed her husband, then immediately wrote a children's book about helping kids cope with the loss of a parent, and went on local television to promote it. Case 10. Corey Richens, the grief author who wrote a children's book about her own murder. At just past 3 in the morning on March 4, 2022, in a quiet mountain town called Camas, Utah, about 40 miles southeast of Salt Lake City, a 911 dispatcher picked up a call from a panicked woman. The woman said her name was Corey Richens. She told the dispatcher that her husband was unresponsive in their bed. She said she could not wake him up. She said something was very wrong. The first responders arrived within minutes. Inside the bedroom of a beautiful home near the ski town of Park City, a 39-year-old man named Eric Richens was lying motionless. He was already dead. The paramedics declared him gone at the scene. The only people in the house at the time of the call were Corey, Eric, and the couple's 3 young sons, all under the age of 10. The boys were asleep when their father died. Corey was 32 years old. She was a mother of 3. She was a real estate investor. She told everyone she was heartbroken. She gave interviews. She posted tributes. About a year later, she would self-publish a children's book about coping with the loss of a father. She would promote it on local television. She would dedicate it to her amazing husband. On May 8, 2023, just weeks after one of those television interviews, Corey Richens was arrested at her home. She was charged with the aggravated murder of the husband she had spent a year publicly mourning. Corey Richens was born in 1989 in Utah. She grew up in the Salt Lake City area. She married Eric Richens in 2013. Eric was a few years older than her. He owned and operated a successful masonry business. He was, by every account from his family and friends, a hard-working, dedicated father, a quiet man who loved his 3 boys, and a smart businessman who had built up real wealth over the years. By the time of his death, his estate was worth more than $4 million. Corey ran a real estate company. She flipped houses. She presented herself online as a successful entrepreneur. The truth was different. By early 2022, she was about $4.5 million in debt. Her business was struggling. She had been spending money she did not have to project an image of success. She had also been having an affair with another man named Robert Josh Grossman. There was one major problem in Corey's plan to leave Eric and start over. The prenuptial agreement she had signed with Eric back in 2013 was very specific. If she divorced him, she would not get most of his money. There was one important exception. If Eric died while they were still legally married, the rules of the prenup did not apply. The math was simple. Divorce meant losing everything. Eric's death meant gaining everything. Corey did not know one important detail. Eric had figured out years earlier that Corey had been taking money from his accounts and racking up debts in his name. Quietly, without telling her, he had updated his will. He had cut her out of it almost entirely. The estate she believed she would inherit if he died had already been redirected to his sister and his children in a trust. In early 2022, according to the prosecution case, Corey began asking her housekeeper, a woman named Carmen Lauber, to help her get fentanyl. Fentanyl is an extremely powerful drug. Even tiny amounts can kill a person. Lauber agreed to help. She got pills from a drug dealer she knew. She handed them to Corey. On Valentine's Day, February 14, 2022, Corey left Eric a sandwich and a note before going out to meet her boyfriend. Eric ate the sandwich. Within hours, he was breaking out in hives, vomiting, and blacking out. He survived. Eric told his sister later that he believed his wife had tried to poison him. Corey waited a few weeks and asked Lauber for more pills. According to court documents, she specifically asked for, in her own words, the Michael Jackson stuff. The reference was to the powerful drug combination that had killed the singer. Lauber understood. She got more fentanyl. She delivered it on February 26, 2022. 6 days later, on the night of March 3, 2022, Corey made Eric a Moscow Mule cocktail. She told him they were celebrating closing on a property for her real estate business. Eric drank it. The drink contained 5 times the lethal dose of fentanyl. By 3 in the morning, he was dead. The investigation moved quickly. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as fentanyl overdose. The fentanyl was illicit, not from a prescription, and had been swallowed. Eric had no history of drug use. Detectives interviewed Lauber. She told them everything. They pulled Corey's phone records. They pulled her search history. The internet history included searches for women's prisons in Utah, luxury prisons for the rich in America, and questions about whether police could force someone to take a lie detector test. She had also deleted more than 800 text messages with Lauber from the months before Eric's death. The most disturbing piece of evidence came after the arrest. Corey had self-published a children's book in early 2023 called Are You With Me? The book was about a father who had passed away and was watching over his young son from heaven with angel wings. She had promoted it on local Utah TV and radio stations. In one interview filmed just weeks before her arrest, She had spoken softly about how writing the book had brought peace to her and her boys. The image of the smiling, gentle author talking about helping children cope with grief, while she was secretly the cause of that grief, would become the defining image of the entire case. Corey Richens was arrested on May 8, 2023. She was charged with aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder for the Valentine's Day sandwich, and several charges related to forgery and insurance fraud. Investigators discovered she had also taken out multiple life insurance policies on Eric without his knowledge, totaling close to $2 million. She had also forged documents giving her control over his estate. She was held in custody from her arrest forward. While in jail, she was caught attempting to smuggle a letter to her own mother that asked her mother to coach Corey's brother into giving false testimony. The letter was intercepted by jail staff. Her trial began on February 23, 2026, at the Summit County Courthouse in Park City, Utah. The prosecution was led by Summit County Chief Prosecutor Brad Bloodworth. The state showed the jury the prenuptial agreement, the secret will, the housekeeper's testimony, the search history, the deleted messages, the Valentine's Day attempt, the texts to her boyfriend Grossman about a future without Eric, and the children's book. The state argued that Corey had murdered Eric for money she would never have actually received because Eric had quietly cut her out of his will years earlier. Corey Richens did not testify. Her defense team rested without calling a single witness. They argued that the prosecution's case was circumstantial, that the housekeeper was lying for legal protection, and that no fentanyl had ever been physically found in Corey's home. On March 16, 2026, the jury convicted Corey Richens of aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, fraud, and forgery. The judge read the verdict. Corey lowered her head. The murder conviction alone carries a sentence of 25 years to life under Utah law. Her formal sentencing was scheduled for May 2026. Corey's 3 young sons were placed in the care of Eric's family after her arrest. They will grow up reading about their mother in the news. They will grow up knowing their father was poisoned by the woman who wrote the book about helping them grieve. The book itself remains the most chilling artifact of the entire case. A children's storybook, illustrated and warm, about a father with angel wings watching his son. Written, published and promoted by the woman who put him in the ground. Eric Richens never got to see his 3 sons grow up. He never got to find out that his wife was the one who killed him. He died believing the cocktail in his hand was a celebration drink. The closing she had been telling him about, the property deal, the toast she made him to celebrate it, were all part of the cover. The Moscow Mule was her plan. The fentanyl was her weapon. The grief book was the cleanup. 10 wives, 10 husbands gone. 10 different methods, from teenagers with hollow point bullets to turkey basters in bedrooms, from stolen keys at 5 in the morning to neckties in suburban Texas, from Mercedes sedans in hotel parking lots to suitcases floating in the Chesapeake Bay, from shotguns held by manipulated lovers to chat rooms reaching across state lines, from 17 years of buried silence to a children's book published over a fresh grave. Every one of these women promised to love their husbands until death parted them. Every one of them decided to be the death that did the parting. And every one of them is currently sitting in a prison cell, or buried in one, paying the price for the moment they decided that the man who trusted them most was worth less than what they could get if he were gone. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.